Hello, Tanse, et lanete, ani, bonjour. Welcome back to our shared politics. My name is Nova. I am a settler on Turtle Island. I created this podcast to really showcase socialism instead of pursuing the Red Scare blindly, which just pushes people further apart. I wish to express acknowledgement that I am on Treaty 8 territory, home to the Tetskene, Deneza, Nehiawak, Saulteaux, and BC Métis. It is essential I recognize all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, both status and non-status, as the guardians of these lands. As a non-Indigenous person, I play a role as a treaty partner, being represented by the government. My pronouns are she, her, but I also accept they, them, and I fall under the 2S LGBTQIA+ umbrella. I say these things at the top of every episode, so you're able to make a decision on how safe of a person I am. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railway laid. All the world that's owned by idle drones is ours and ours alone. We have laid the wide foundations, built it skyward, stone by stone. It is ours not to slave in, but to master and to own. This is a poem by Ralph Chaplin and was the beginning to a synthesis written by Judah Hill that I found online a few weeks ago titled On the Role of the Petty Bourgeoisie in Proletarian Revolution, with the subtitle A Polemic Against Professor Szymanski's Class Line. This was written in 1976, which was 48 years ago. I didn't go looking for Al Szymanski's paper that seems to have incited this response, but Judah Hill did a pretty good job of summarizing within the introduction. So, briefly stated, Szymanski's thesis is that 1. Socialist revolution is in the interests of both the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat. 2. Therefore, the class interests of the petty bourgeoisie are compatible with the class interests of the proletariat, and an alliance of the two classes against the bourgeoisie can be made. 3. The petty bourgeoisie must in the end make an alliance under the leadership of either the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, and failure of the proletariat to forge an alliance with the petty bourgeoisie will drive the petty bourgeoisie into the camp of the bourgeoisie. Without a class alliance within the petty bourgeoisie, the proletariat is incapable of successfully overthrowing capitalism and will thus be doomed to fascism. However, Judah Hill and the League for Proletarian Socialism takes the position that 1. Socialist revolution is not in the interests of the dominant sectors of the petty bourgeoisie. 2. Therefore, no long-term class alliance can be made on a principled basis between the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat. 3. The petty bourgeoisie will pursue its own class interests. The petty bourgeoisie is much more threatened by proletarian socialist revolution than by the maintenance of monopoly capitalism, and thus in a showdown between proletarian socialism and capitalism, it will oppose the proletariat. 4. A class alliance between the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat can only be made if the working class agrees to maintain capitalist relations of production. Thus, a class alliance within the petty bourgeoisie precludes the possibility of building a proletarian socialist society and dooms the working class to some form of welfare state or state capitalism. So, the petty bourgeoisie can be broken down into two groups nowadays, the old petty and the new petty. The old petty bourgeoisie are the self-employed, small farmers, and small business owners, while the new petty bourgeoisie are salaried managers and professionals employed by capital. Quote, the old petty has been whittled away by the advance of monopoly capital, where small farmers who once made up the largest single sector of the population have all but vanished. The small businessmen who once dominated Main Street America have dwindled away in both numbers and influence. The vast number of independent artisans, such as blacksmiths and tailors, have been driven into the factories and transformed into the proletariat. End quote. Judah Hill and Karl Marx both knew this was not going to be temporary and that it was simply one of the symptoms of capitalism. While both the old petty and new petty are part of the same class, the fundamental difference is, quote, the fact that the old petty bourgeoisie stands outside the capital-labor relationship, while the new petty bourgeoisie functions inside the capital-labor relationship as the employee and agent of capital, end quote. The old middle class occupied that position by virtue of its place occupied the polar class structure. It possessed the attributes of neither capitalist nor worker. It played no direct role in the capital accumulation process, whether on one side or the other. This new middle class, by contrast, occupies its intermediate position not because it is outside the process of increasing capital, but because, as part of this process, it takes its characteristics from both sides. Clearly, the shift from being a class outside the capital-labor relationship to a class within that relationship has had profound effects on the nature of the class and its relationships with other classes. So Hill used the 1970 census and other data to find the approximate median incomes of 1969 for professionals and managers versus proletariats. Professionals' incomes were twice that of workers, while managers' incomes were 1.5 times that of workers. Judah Hill goes on to explain, saying, the importance of these figures is simply this. The much higher level of income paid by capital to the typical member of the new petty bourgeoisie represents a share of the surplus value extracted from the working class. The income they receive represents not just an exchange of their labor power for money, but a share in the surplus value produced by the proletariat. This share of surplus value is given to the new petty bourgeoisie in order to attach them to the success of the corporation, to give them a stake in the capitalist system. So Szymanski then goes on to state, the new petty bourgeoisie's antagonism to monopoly capitalism is based on their lack of fundamental control over the conditions of their labor and their uses of their product or service. Scientists are not really able to determine what kind of research they will do or how their work will be used because of corporate funding and direction of their work. University teachers are under great pressure to mass-produce students without raising fundamental criticisms of the way things are. Social workers are forced to act like policemen. Architects are made to design monstrosities rather than socially useful buildings. Engineers are required to design cars which fall apart and factories that pollute, etc. So in that whiny paragraph, Szymanski equates lack of control over direction of labor with the lack of control over the labor process itself. By equating the lack of control over the product with lack of control over the labor process, Szymanski is able to obscure and paper over the basic contradiction between the new petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The proletariat does lack control over its labor process. The new petty bourgeoisie does not lack such control. By and large, they decide in what manner they carry out their assigned tasks. They set their own pace, choose how best to accomplish what they have to do, in many cases set their own hours, and generally work as they see fit. Their major constraint is to produce a certain result in a certain specified time. This is a far, far cry from the conditions of labor of the working class. Salaried professors are not wedded to a machine that forces their every movement into conformity with the dictum of maximum production for minimum labor time. Salaried managers are not treated as ignorant, bestial wage slaves who have to be directed to come here, go there, do this, pick up that, work harder, work faster, do what I tell you, shut up, sit down, type this, clean that, drive there. In short, the new petty bourgeoisie are not taylorized. They do not labor under a system in which conception has been ripped asunder from execution, a system in which there is a drive toward total separation of conception and execution. In fact, the opposite is the case. It is the new petty bourgeoisie who directly supervise and control the labor of the proletariat. So in the Proletariat Revolution, the proletariats will be fighting to eliminate class society, while the new petty bourgeoisie will be fighting to upgrade their privileged position within the class society. Their struggle with the bourgeoisie is a struggle for a share in the spoils of the class system. This conflict has a dual nature. The bourgeoisie will want to keep the petty in a restricted form of freedom and power, letting them believe they have a real say in the system, as Szymanski whined about. On the other hand, though, the expansion of monopolies provides increased job opportunities, income, and prestige for the petty. To put it bluntly, this is a fundamental difference between the two classes, those being the proletariat and the petty bourgeoisie, and it's going to be the petty bourgeoisie that will have to make a choice. I'd like to think they will side with us, but I know in my heart that whatever the new petty bourgeoisie will struggle for will be in their own interests, not the interests of the proletariat. That much is obvious. Something I found really interesting here was Hale's breakdown of the power of each class. So the problem facing the new petty bourgeoisie is a thorny one. How can they maintain or enlarge their power vis-a-vis the bourgeoisie while at the same time preventing the working class from instituting proletarian socialism? The bourgeoisie has the power of wealth, ownership of the productive forces of society, hegemony over the state, and power over the new petty bourgeoisie as individuals. On the other side, the proletariat has vast numbers, class hatred of the capitalist system, and the potential to seize and operate the machinery of society. The new petty bourgeoisie have neither the wealth and power of the bourgeoisie, nor the size, determination, and potential of the working class, but this does not mean they are helpless. The new petty bourgeoisie are strategically located in that while the bourgeoisie may own the productive forces of society, the new petty bourgeoisie run them on a day-to-day basis. The same is true for the state. The bourgeoisie have hegemony, but the state is actually operated day-to-day by the new petty bourgeoisie. They have power that can be used against individual members or even large sectors of the working class. The new petty bourgeoisie also possess a vital block of technical, managerial, and professional skills that are necessary for society to maintain itself. Which I think is interesting because seeing the fact that the proletariat has the potential means that we could always easily learn how to do administration and how to run the show. There's no reason why we couldn't. And if anything, it would be better for us to learn how to do it because we'd be given back to our own people afterwards. We wouldn't just be keeping all the money for ourselves, the money that someone else made off the sweat of their backs that we get a cut in and they don't. So historically, the petty bourgeoisie has often used the working class for its own ends, betraying the proletariat when it became advantageous to do so. Only by mobilizing the proletariat to fight for petty bourgeois socialism can the new petty bourgeoisie increase its power vis-a-vis the bourgeoisie. So how might they successfully pull this off? Hale states, 1. Covering over the contradictions between the new petty bourgeoisie and the working class. 2. Defining the goal of struggle, socialist revolution, in such a way that the class interests of the new petty bourgeoisie are not threatened by an alteration in the relations of production at the base. 3. Convince the proletariat and the organizations that lead them that without a class alliance between the working class and the new petty bourgeoisie, the revolution cannot succeed. 4. Form such a class alliance, the basis of which is an agreement by the proletariat that the class position of the new petty bourgeoisie will not be threatened by the working class. And 5. Use the stranglehold of the new petty bourgeoisie on technical, managerial, and professional skills to maintain their class position during and after the revolution. There is no doubt that working class needs and wants a more equitable distribution of the wealth they produce. Vast numbers of the proletariat live in working conditions of poverty, and the promise of a better standard of living is a powerful motive force for revolution. The new petty bourgeoisie seizes on the cry for economic justice and a fair share of the wealth in order to win leadership over the proletariat. They focus all attention on the question of distribution of wealth and material rewards so that the question of the manner in which the working class produces that wealth will be ignored. The new petty bourgeoisie uses the issue of equitable distribution of wealth to make the argument that their interests and the interests of the working class are the same, that both will benefit from a fair division of the products of human labor. Aside from the historical fact that it always seems that the share of the new petty bourgeoisie ends up larger than that is given to the proletariat, there is another worm in this apple of distribution. The new petty bourgeoisie claim that both they and the working class have identical interests in raising the material standards of living, but this is not the case. The new petty bourgeoisie control their own labor process and thus are protected from the toil, tedium, pain, danger, and exhaustion of production, clerical, and service work. They primarily look at wealth from the point of view of consumption, but take an attitude of the more, the better. But members of the working class have to bear the burden of the human and social costs of production, and thus look at wealth from 2 points of view, that of consumer and of producer. From the point of view of those who have to pay the human costs of production, more is not necessarily better. The working class may desire a material standard of living quite a bit below that which would be physically possible to produce if they worked as hard as humanly possible. Time to spend with family, less tailorized workplaces, more individual creativity, more education may all be more important to the working class than having the maximum amount of material goods. On the other hand, the new petty bourgeoisie, who do not suffer the human cost of production, who already control their labor process, who see wealth only in terms of consumption, will tend towards the maximization of production. Of course, this will all be dressed up in fine-sounding phrases, but the essence is that the working class will pay the cost of a consumption-oriented society run by the new petty bourgeoisie. So Szymanski makes an argument that if the proletariat is unsuccessful, the petty bourgeoisie will turn towards fascism. The danger of this is Hill's response. The danger of fascism in America arises from the threat of proletarian revolution and or the world crisis of capitalism. To make a class alliance with the new petty bourgeoisie may avoid the danger of fascism arising from this class, but only at the cost of also avoiding proletarian revolution, given if this is done, fascism can still arise directly from the bourgeoisie. What has been shown in many countries is that wherever fascism may come from, the only force capable of defeating it is a strong working class, organized and led in its own interests and not amputated by the necessities of keeping a chimerical alliance with the petty bourgeoisie. Szymanski begins laying down terms that he thinks the proletariats must abide by in order to successfully perform a revolution. However, seeing as he is part of the petty bourgeoisie, it's to be expected that he thinks more highly of himself than maybe he should. All the privileges and prerogatives of the professionals must be guaranteed in advance by the workers. Tough luck for the secretaries, lab assistants, nurses' aides, orderlies, file clerks, and draftsmen who have to work over these lords of creation. This is Hill's response. But Szymanski is not through yet. He has more terms to lay down. Further, it means guaranteeing that only gradually over the course of a generation or two will they gradually lose their privileges as the conditions of everyone is greatly improved, i.e. that rather than them sinking to the level of the current proletariat, that the condition of the proletariat will be brought up. Think, rising tide floats all boats. So, even in the realm of income, the working class must promise that the privileges of the new petty bourgeoisie will not be touched. They can keep their high salaries, paid by our surplus value, and fine living, while it takes 2 generations for us to haul ourselves up to their level. 2 generations. This demand by Szymanski that we must put off until some vague date far in the future the dream of proletarian socialism is nothing less than a demand that we surrender the idea of proletarian socialism, that we agree to fight and die in order to replace the bourgeoisie with the new petty bourgeoisie as our masters, that we trade our one ruling class for another, that we let the new petty bourgeoisie ride our struggle into a form of socialism that is indistinguishable from state capitalism. Why does Szymanski insist that altering the relations of production be put off into the far future? Because it is in his class interests? Oh, no, not at all. He's much too altruistic for that. You see, the working class is incapable of abolishing the class relations of production, that is, taking control, and if we tried, it would create chaos and disaster. Szymanski writes, "It is sufficient and actually socially necessary that the division of labor be only gradually abolished. A sudden abolition would produce total social disruption, and thus there be no false fear generated among the new petty bourgeoisie that their position will be destroyed overnight." Here lies the essence of Szymanski's class chauvinism, arrogance, and petty bourgeoisie class standpoint. He says that if the working class tried to run society, it would produce total social disruption. What does he think revolution is? A tea party? Here's the arrogance and chauvinism of the new petty bourgeoisie for the proletariat. We are incapable of doing what they do. It will take us 2 generations or longer to learn to fill their shoes. They are the precious elite of society, and they must not be dirtied, restricted, or demoted, lest the ground shake and the heavens fall. So, will the new petty bourgeoisie be with us or against us when the revolution comes? It's a sobering thought, and it's completely up to them. And I kind of think I know what the decision will be. This was a lot faster than I thought it was going to be. I thought this episode was going to take me a lot longer. But yeah, as always, thank you for joining me today. I drop a new episode every Monday, so check back in next week to see what I'll be sharing with you then. So-called Canada is in a fentanyl and mental health crisis right now. Please consider picking up a free naloxone kit at your local pharmacy and do not use alone. For any Indigenous listeners out there, the Hope for Wellness Helpline offers immediate culturally aware and trauma-informed help to all Indigenous people across Canada. It is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in French and English to offer immediate support and crisis intervention. While there are supports in Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuktitut, those are not available 24/7, so you may need to call in to find out the next time that a language speaker will be available. Call the toll-free helpline at 1-855-242-3310 or connect to the online chat at www.hopeforwellness.ca. And there is also the Thunderbird Wellness app that provides access to Indigenous perspectives on health and wellness, including substance abuse and mental health. Now, not that Indigenous people can't use these next resources, but they do not advertise as culturally aware or trauma-informed. So for everyone else, if you must use alone, please keep in mind you can call 1-888-688-6677 to contact the National Overdose Response Services to access support while using and especially using alone. And there is the Brave, BRAVE app, with a use alone timer that connects a paramedic with your location if you don't respond. For mental health support, you can contact 988 to get connected to a crisis responder. If you learned something new today, it'd be awesome if you'd click that button and follow along for next time. Or if you'd like to contact me with feedback, you can email me at oursharedpodcast@gmail.com.